What is up, everybody? Welcome into another edition of Hoops 360. On today's episode, we catch up with the bracketologist extraordinaire. ESPN's Charlie Creme stops by. Plus, is the post-Caitlin Clark era at Iowa taking flight? Wink, wink, no pun intended with the Hawkeyes there. Plus, we'll spotlight our players of the week and the WNBA schedule release, some of our takeaways from what we learned from the schedule. Before we get into it, just a reminder to all of our listeners out there, whether it's your first time, welcome in. If you listen every single week, appreciate your loyalty, but you can always reach out to us. If you want to comment down below with a take that you disagree with, a question that you have, a topic that you want us to touch on, we're here for you. We're a show of the people, so let us know down below if you're watching on YouTube, but of course you can always catch us on your preferred podcast platform as well. She is Cassandra Negley. I am Caroline Fenton. Cass, another week of women's basketball behind us, and you had an awesome breakdown in your AP Top 25 rankings, highlighting what the post-Caitlin Clark era has looked like at Iowa. They are fresh off of a massive win over the number 12 Ohio State Buckeyes. They now have 3 top 15 wins in a row. What are your takeaways from this Iowa Hawkeyes team?
For better or worse, Iowa is always going to be described as before Caitlin Clark and after, even though this is a very storied history, very storied state. Like, basketball is huge in Iowa. But people latched on to Caitlin Clark. And so the question was, how would Iowa handle it with her gone? And of course, Lisa Bluder retired shortly after that. So they turned to Jan Jensen. Well, they're doing pretty great. They reached the top 10 for the first time since Clark's era in last week's poll. Obviously, they take down their third-ranked opponent and did it in an incredible fashion against Ohio State. Avoided a loss to Maryland, which was touch and go. But this is a team that can do a little bit of everything. They're passing up good looks for great ones. 21.3 assists per game has them third in D1. That's up from last year and kind of in line with those Caitlin Clark-led teams. And they're shooting the ball well because they are getting good looks. They're shooting almost 50%, seventh in D1. And they can shoot some threes when needed too, about 37%. But it starts and ends with their work in the paint. And that has a lot to do with Hannah Stuelke, who's a senior now. She played with Caitlin Clark, but also sophomore Ava Hayden. They're overpowering opponents in the paint. And if you look at those wins and some of the losses to top opponents, the paint is what made the difference.
And you mentioned they do a little bit of everything. And I think that's so true. They're on an 8-game winning streak. They haven't allowed more than 80 points in all of those games. They look at their win over Ohio State, 4 players with double-digit points. Addie Zeal with 20 points off the bench, 4 players with 30-plus minutes, and Ava Hayden, like you just mentioned, just missing that 30-minute threshold at 27 minutes. This is such a complete team, Cass.
Yeah, and you mentioned defense. Like, Jan Jensen, when she took over, she was a longtime assistant for Lisa Bluder. Like, there is no new face in the locker room leading them. A lot of players decided to stay when she took over the job. You know, it feels very like a continuation of Iowa. There is no newness there, but last year when she took over, she talked about we're probably going to have to tap into our defense a little more. I think you saw that through the schedule last year. That's very much the same this year. She talked a little about it after the Ohio State win, but that's where it starts. Defense is huge for them, and they can play a really good offensive game. So we've talked kind of all season about UCLA owning the Big Ten, especially with Juju Watkins out. They're going to play UCLA this weekend. That'll be a good test for Iowa and might push UCLA.
And I was just about to ask you, too. I mean, I was getting ready for their West Coast road trip. They'll take on USC on Thursday. Then they have that matchup against UCLA. We've seen that those West Coast road trips can be incredibly difficult. Overwhelming advantage for the West Coast team hosting an East Coast team and vice versa. Any of those West Coast teams taking those long road trips, you can tell that sometimes the fatigue catches up with them. But even understanding all of that, even understanding the tough road that Iowa has ahead of them, because even when they do get back from that West Coast road trip, well, then they'll take on a top 25 Washington team that next week. But is Iowa the biggest threat to UCLA right now in the Big Ten?
I think so. Certainly through the standings, certainly the work that they can do in the paint. Now they're going to have to be very thoughtful about that. Lauren Betts is one of the better shot blockers. She patrols the paint. She's a little bit of a defensive cheat code just because she is 6'7" and can move down there very nicely. For Iowa, I thought Jan Jensen kind of pointed it out in terms of this winning streak they're on, that they have to believe that they're a really good team. They don't need to be so timid because they are a good team. I think that's a game that should be circled. We're going to get into that a little bit later. Obviously, they're without Taylor McCabe. She tore her ACL in that win over Ohio State. Her sister actually later that day sustained a serious ankle injury in her game for Drake, I believe. So a brutal day for the McCabe sisters. But that's how Addie Deal, the freshman, stepped up. This is always kind of been a team, this is true of a lot of teams, right? But this is a team where you just do that. Everyone remembers Molly Davis being injured kind of around tournament time, and the next player stepped up. That's very much, what they trained for all season. So that'll be difficult to go to Los Angeles with a new starting lineup like this, but that's just another test. And I think everything that you do now prepares you for March. And certainly that's the way you want to look at it if you're Iowa.
What a brutal day for the McCabe family. Those poor parents. There's two different ways to look at it. Obviously through the sympathetic lens for Taylor McCabe, who is a senior at Iowa. She's been there the last 4 years. It's fair to assume that she's played her last minutes in an Iowa uniform, that her career's now over. That's, I think, the worst possible way to step away from your career is not on your own terms, is not just graduating a senior, but your season and your career being cut so short like that. Like, of course, just as a human, I have so much sympathy for her for that. But like you mentioned, also a difficult challenge that I was going to have to get through, relying on their depth and relying on some of those young players that maybe initially head coach Jan Jensen wasn't predicting to rely on, at least this early, and relying on in a really difficult road trip, but they're going to have to rely on and lean on, which in turn could make them that much more prepared for March.
Yeah, and for the coming seasons, you want to. She talked in that post game about like this happens sometimes. You hope it doesn't, but it's the reality. She had this really good metaphor about farming when she grew up. Like you could be the best farmer and do the best thing for your crops, and weather happens, right? Like injuries happen, but she talked about preparing for this in June. And I think for Addie Deal, she's been able to sit back and watch and see what it takes. And she'll now have an opportunity to step up in a big way moving forward. And that'll, help determine the rest of her Iowa career as well. Hannah Stuelke is a senior, but Ava Heiden's a sophomore. And, when you talk about Iowa and Jan Jensen, she's the post whisperer. They have a long legacy of really solid posts that have been what guided them. Caitlin Clark, drew all of the headlines and attention, and for good reason. But a lot of that had to do with Monica Cesano hitting something like 78% of her shots as her pick and roll partner, right? You look back at 2019, Megan Gustafson won the Naismith Award as a post for Iowa. She just won the WNBA championship with the Aces. So there's good things to come from Ava Heiden, this season and moving forward.
Yeah. 1000%. Cass, you have Iowa ranked number 8 in your AP poll. The AP poll also has Iowa at number 8. They are the along with UCLA, they are the 2 undefeated teams in conference play. Iowa sitting just behind UCLA in their overall records. Iowa sitting with 2 losses, and absolutely a team that we will keep our eyes on, even without Caitlin Clark in an Iowa uniform. Absolutely a team that we're going to keep our eyes on as we go through conference play and into March as well. But USC Iowa, UCLA Iowa, absolutely must-see TV. But before we look ahead to the games that we have upcoming, Cass, I do want to look back. We do it every single week. Our player spotlights of the week for you goes to who?
You and I just talked about freshman of the year candidates. We talked about Aaliyah Chavez. There's always a moment for a player that's like the welcome to the nation moment. She's had a really good season, but you need the game level, you need the opponent, you need the TV, all of it. She had it. She took advantage. amazing game for her in the latter stages of that upset win over South Carolina. She had 15 of the team's 19 points in overtime. Yes, 19 in overtime. Completely blasted the Gamecocks. They did not look like themselves. We know that they bounced back, but Chavez also had an assist on one of the other two baskets. She just was finding her spots, looked comfortable, rebounded from maybe a difficult first half. Very impressive showing for her, especially in terms of freshman of the year. But if you're looking at what Oklahoma could maybe do in the tournament, that's the kind of success that they need from their freshman point guard now and moving forward.
Because when I saw Aaliyah Chavez go off against South Carolina, I kind of thought, I was like, did we do that? Did we speak that into existence? We were just taught, we were giving Aaliyah Chavez her flowers for freshman of the year, which of course was very much so deserved. She very much so had the resume for it. But like you said, doing it on that stage against that team and doing it so emphatically. Like, it's hard to call ourselves Aaliyah Chavez hipsters, as she was the number one recruit in the country and 5-star. Jenny Bronchek talked about, Oklahoma women's basketball coach talked about how she was the crown jewel of that team. But to talk about Aaliyah Chavez the way that we did, very rightfully so, and then for her to have that kind of exclamation point performance, it was awesome to see. Massive, massive win for Oklahoma. But for my player of the week, I'm going to go on the losing side of that matchup and how they followed up that loss at Oklahoma. And my player of the week is Tania Latson at South Carolina. Now, South Carolina came back in one of the biggest games of the year so far. They hosted undefeated Vanderbilt, a 20-game winning streak. And this road trip to Columbia, South Carolina was, to you, to me, to a lot of us, a big measuring stick game for Vanderbilt. Like, okay, you've proven a lot of us wrong based off of preseason expectations. Just how close are you to the South Carolinas and the Texases of the SEC? Now, South Carolina with a massive 103-74 victory over Vanderbilt. But I'm highlighting Tania Latson not just for what she did against Vanderbilt. Tania Latson's final stat line, 21 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, 2 steals. But I think it was even more impactful for me. Great performance. She led the team in points, but it was even more impactful for me when you just zoom out a little bit. Because she was out for a couple of weeks with a lower leg injury. She sustained against Providence before going into conference play. She came off of her season low 6 points against Oklahoma in that loss that we talked about in overtime. 6 points. We're talking about Tania Latson, who led all of women's college basketball in scoring last year. Like, that is a very rare air and rare territory for her to be in. She comes back against Vanderbilt, scores 10 points in the first 10 minutes of that game, had 7 in the third quarter when Vandy was kind of coming back and fighting back in that third quarter. And behind Tania Latson's offense, that really just kind of put the game on ice. She showed off defensively. She was guarding Aubrey Galvin, who she held her to just 7 points, forced 4 turnovers in that game. That was another big reason why South Carolina was able to win that game so emphatically, 32 points off of turnovers. So I thought it was just a really great get-back game for Tania Latson, coming back off of injury, coming off of not her best game against Oklahoma. I wanted to give her flowers for somebody who I expect to play a really massive role for South Carolina offensively.
Yeah. We're really SEC heavy here, but we'd be remiss if we also didn't call out Mia Paldo, a freshman for Tennessee. Yeah. She had a big fourth quarter in that win over Kentucky and was really kind of their key cog to get that done. An impressive look for her. 21 points, 9 in the fourth, and they had a 2-point win there. Very SEC this week.
Very SEC this week, but we've also, that's just kind of where we are at this point in the schedule, that you're getting these ranked on ranked matchups and you're getting these games that are going to be, I think really picked apart come resume time, come March Madness time. Like, these are when you step up in big moments in the games that matter most, whether it's on the road against ranked opponents or just against ranked opponents as a whole, that stands out. But I'm glad you gave Mia Paldo some love there. She absolutely deserves it. Those are our players of the week, but I mentioned it. We're getting close to tournament time, resume time. We're going to be talking about net more over the next couple of months than we have in a very long time. So who better to bring on to talk about that than bracketologist extraordinaire Charlie Creme? He will join us coming up next. Joining us now on the program, because we're almost at that time, it is quickly approaching, is ESPN bracketologist Charlie Creme. Charlie, appreciate you for joining us because I know that you are soon to be one of the busiest men in America once March rolls around. But before we get into the field and some of your takeaways from the season so far, I do want to take a step back and just kind of take a philosophical look at women's basketball where we are right now. Every year, it feels like on the men's side, we have Cinderellas, group of 5 teams, mid-major teams that look like they can make legitimate runs to the Elite Eight, Final Four, and potentially even national championship. Why don't we have that on the women's side?
I think, and this is what I tell people a lot, the women's basketball is still on a different timeline than the men. I mean, think back to the NCAA tournament or crowning a national champion via the NCAA in men's basketball started in 1939. It started in 1980 for women's basketball. So there's basically men's basketball's had a 40-year head start in terms of the timeline of how the sport's evolved, how the sport's been treated by athletic departments, by media. So I wouldn't call it catch-up mode. It's just that there's a different trajectory that we're working with women's basketball. And I think it's important to remember that in the comparison and be patient. And the growth has been outstanding and it's been exciting and it's been a lot of fun. But it's still not where men's basketball in the 70s was different than women's basketball in the 70s. And it's still different today to some degree in terms of that. Now, in terms of attention and people's watching and people reading and paying attention, I think that gap is closed closer than that 40-year gap that I indicated. So there is a catch-up mode that's happening at breakneck speed. But we're not there yet in terms of just the depth maybe of the sport in terms of competition quite yet. It's better. It's certainly better than it was, although, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, a little bit later. This year may not be the best example of that, given that the 4 best teams in the country are the same 4 teams who played in the Final Four a year ago, and the champ is the current lone undefeated team left in the country. But I think your question is great. And I've had these conversations before, and I think that's what I always point to is just remember the track is different, and women's basketball has had little moments where we get Cinderellas popping in there, but it hasn't been the consistency I think that you indicated with the men. But we'll get there; it's coming.
Because of all of the changes in college basketball as a whole right now, NIL, all of that kind of stuff. What is the recipe to have more Cinderellas in the future then? Is it about the bracket? Is it about just building depth? Is it something completely different that you see coming down the line?
I think it all kind of starts with getting the right coach. And there's a lot of programs that have done that. They've made coaching changes, and that coach has been the recipe for success. I mean, you look at Texas. Texas has always been a historically good program, but wasn't having big-time national success more recently until Vic Schaefer got there. They found the right coach, and he's turned them into a national title contender, whereas a few years before his arrival, they were essentially maybe a Sweet 16 contender. So I think that's a big part of it. And part of being that right coach is knowing the recruiting base, bringing in the high levels of talent. And some of that now has to do with the commitment of athletic departments to women's basketball in the NIL space. So there's all of those things are configuring to form what's a successful program and what's not a successful program. I think we've seen it with regard to the transfer portal and NIL in football, bring a little bit more balance, if you want to call it that, or spread out the abilities to succeed. Because I think you could point to football from a few years ago, and it was the same teams over and over and over again. And now when people would complain about that with women's basketball, they were big college football fans. I'd say, hey, come on. What are we really talking about here? It's the same teams in college football too. That has changed a little bit in the last couple of years. And I think there's something there. If there's a non-traditional powerhouse women's basketball program or 2 or 10 that want to invest a little bit more in women's basketball, they see the payoff there. Then if the finances are there to spend on rosters, because let's face it, that's what's happening in football and in men's basketball as well, then I think you'll start to see some of the talent spread out a little bit more. I do think we still see a talent base that tends to focus on the same schools. And while we do have a lot of women's basketball players transferring, I think the big time programs, if you really look at South Carolina, say, or UConn, for instance, those players tend not to leave those programs. Whereas in some of the other sports, it doesn't matter what the program is or who the coach is, players leave. So hats off to those programs and those coaches. They keep their players. And in women's basketball, obviously, you can keep a formed roster if as long as they're not transferring. They're not going pro like the men are after a season. So you keep that core group together, and you're going to be able to build that ability to dominate. And when you're turning over things, it's more subtle. Whereas sometimes with men's programs, you're turning over 6, 7, 8 players season after season, and you're going to get some inconsistency in success rates. And some people will point to that as a good thing, but it also points to constantly that constant turnover means there's less to identify with the men's side of things too.
I think that's another reason why it's been so easy to tune into and to root for women's college basketball is these players are sticking around for 4 or 5 years. It's so much easier to fall in love with a personality whenever they're not one and done, and you can kind of learn them and watch them grow year over year. But, we mentioned how there's so much chalk this year. UConn's the best team in the country. South Carolina, Texas, UCLA, the teams that we've seen, at least in recent history, successful are the best teams in the country this year. But we also have Vanderbilt, who was just handed their first loss of the season after a 20-game win streak. We have Princeton, that's only lost 1 game so far this season. Looking at the entire field, who has been the biggest surprise to you up until this point?
I think you hit on Vanderbilt. I thought they'd be good. I didn't foresee top 5 good. That's for sure. I didn't see 20 games in a row good. Michaela Blake's obviously was great last year, and she's great this year. And when and that is another part of, how do we expand the contenders? Well, when you can land a player, a non-traditional program, say like Vanderbilt, they have a decent history, but not so much recently. But when you can land a player like that, it's program changing. I often talk about, people talk about who's the best player in the history of XYZ program. I like to look at who's the most important player, because sometimes you just get that one right player that sort of flips the script, and then the ball starts rolling down the hill a little bit easier. And then you become a more traditional, you go into that little world of traditional power. You win year after year after year because now you've created this momentum within the program. So I would point for all of those reasons, I would point to Vanderbilt as being a surprise. Georgia is another team that's much better than I anticipated. And this is the example of grabbing the right transfer and then making it work very quickly with chemistry. And Danny Carnegie has been kind of a godsend to that program, because where Georgia has struggled in the last few years, number one, being in the SEC is never easy, but they could always defend, but had a lot of trouble scoring against the better teams in the SEC. Well, Carnegie seems to have changed that, or at least on some level, and made them offensively competent. Or maybe you go as far as to say a good offensive team, So now they can score with some of the better teams in the league, and they've elevated. I think they might have been picked 14th in the SEC at the beginning of the year, and they're clearly a top half of the conference. I have them as a 7 seed right now. I think I had them as a fringe tournament team, maybe. It's at different points early in the season, and certainly not in the preseason at all.
We're going to get into a lot of bracketology specific questions with you, but in terms of that with Vanderbilt and Georgia, like when you're going into building your bracket, especially because I think you started at the beginning of this season this year, right? And you've done it.
Now I started in April of the year before.
Oh,
and it starts weekly as soon as the season starts.
No rest for the weary.
People seem to like it, even when it's mostly conjecture and it's not really based on much. But I think I've gotten to the point now where I've got a pretty good grasp of who we can start with, and then we wait for them to really get going in the schedule, and then we make adjustments as necessary.
Well, that's one of my big questions is how much, especially early on, is this just the eye test that you're watching games? And how much of it is looking at the quad 1 and 2 and 3 wins and the resume that they're building in terms of the nitty gritties?
That is a great question. It sort of talks about what's the timeline of the evolution of a singular season of bracketology. And obviously when you're doing a preseason bracket, there's no data to go on. There's no metrics to measure. You're kind of going on what you know. You're looking at the transfer portal. You're looking at recruiting classes. You're looking at the history of some of these coaches and returning players and all of that. And you're building kind of what might make sense. And really that sort of continues, I'd say, for at least the first month, maybe 6 weeks of the season. Because November, you do get a lot of really good games in November where you can start to measure teams, at least empirically, with not just data, but as an actual eye test. You're watching them play, and I'd say that the numbers or the net rankings and things like that really kind of start to come into play mid-December. Certainly when we hit January 1st, that's when things sort of switch. The conference play begins in earnest. In most leagues now, it starts a little bit in December. But it really starts as the regular part of the schedule for everybody. And the data starts to have some real meaning. You're forming enough examples of how a team plays and how it performs so the numbers really do bear accuracy. So I think that's sort of, and then that's when I start doing 2 brackets a week, because now that when we hit January, we're into the new year. We're into the year that the season is identified with that year's tournament, and the wheels start moving a lot faster. So I'd say that's when I kind of come out of your New Year's Day slumber. I rub my eyes and say, okay, we're really going.
Bear is awake.
That's sort of the timeline. I mean, I'm working certainly in November and December, but it starts to take, because people start to pay attention to now that college football lasts a couple more weeks into January than it used to. But nonetheless, I think people who are into basketball say, oh, okay, now we're going to start playing familiar teams. So now maybe it's a little more identifiable that when South Carolina is playing Texas or LSU, then you like, oh, okay, I know these games. These make sense to my memory. So let's start paying attention.
And in that kind of same breath, in terms of, weighting resumes, because I'm sure you are tasked with comparing resumes that have a razor thin difference and a razor thin margin between the two of them. So how do you weigh early season non-conference games versus maybe what's more recent? Because you can't totally ignore what happens in November and December, but you also want to give teams credit for getting better throughout the course of the season. So how do you kind of weigh those two things?
Yeah, I try to follow the committee's lead. My job essentially is to follow the same sort of format or process or thought process even that they follow. And so you look for clues in some of the things that the committee chair will say when we have a chance to talk to him or her during when we do the top 16 reveals, when the NCAA selection committee offers those up to the public. I ask certain questions, or I really listen to what they say for their rationale to give me a clue as to what they might be thinking when we get to the selection Sunday. So if they mention things like, oh, they had this big win in November, even though we're in February, then I know they're really thinking about that non-conference. I certainly think November and December are very important. I've written numerous articles about you cannot ignore this. It's a full season. When we talk about full body of work, November and December are certainly part of that. All those non-conference games, they do matter. But you're also watching games, you're watching teams, and you're watching how they evolve. And you do have to take into consideration this team looks a lot better now than they did previously. Or you have to look at the differences and say, well, is it true? Are they truly better? Has the competition changed? What am I seeing? What are the numbers saying? The best example of that this year is Duke, right? They had a really rough November and December. And now they look like one of the top, certainly 20 teams in the country. Now, the ACC kind of also had a down year. Now Duke's only playing ACC teams. So there's where that razor thin thinking comes into play. Is it truly Duke? Is there a little bit of the competition isn't as good because the ACC isn't as good? I tend to think it's more Duke in this instance, this example, that they are truly better, a lot better, and that I'm not going to knock them because the ACC didn't have a great non-conference run either, and now they're just playing each other. So is it just sort of cannibalism in a sense? But no, you watch Duke, and I think you can see a different team. Like the team that lost to West Virginia when West Virginia only had 5 eligible players to go back on the floor in the second half, versus the team that is playing NC State and Notre Dame, and like that's a different team. It's clearly a different team, and I think anybody would notice that. So all of that goes into play. How much you weigh it, and that's where the subjectivity of this stuff comes into play, and that's where the committee has 12 different people with their own set of ideas of how that should be applied. I have to sort of try to think like 12 people I don't even know, and so you base that kind of on, like I said, what they say and some historical decision making that they've made, and most of the time it hits. But that's, like I said, that's where the subjective part comes in, and my mind could be a little bit different than any one of those 12 people.
The number 1 seeds get a lot of attention, and for good reason, right? And then you have that 4-5 where it's hosting or not hosting. But for you, when you're doing this, where are the margins closest for you? Like, where is it most difficult to bracket teams? What section of the bracket?
I think it is that 4-5, that top 16 situation. Most years, you have a pretty clear-cut idea of at least 2 or 3 of the number 1 seeds. And this year, it's pretty clear-cut on all 4, at least for now. But LSU's they're lurking, I think, when they still get to play South Carolina and they still get to play Texas again. But it's really that who gets into that top 16, because it's so important in women's basketball with the ability to host those games. It's revenue. It's your fan base being that much more engaged, because now you've got 2 more games, the 2 most important games of the season. You get to play on your home floor, and the coaches love to be able to not have to travel. So that's a huge piece of it. And I think of those layers, there's who are the number 1 seeds? Who are the 4 seeds versus the 5 seeds? And who's on the bubble and just misses the field because they're on the wrong side of the bubble? The top 16, I think, is the most difficult. It's also the most important. And because some people would argue, well, the bubble's more important. Making it into the field is a difference maker too financially. It is. But we talked about the depth of the women's game. It's not as deep. The bubble usually comes down to, frankly, just a couple of teams. Sometimes in the top 16, you're looking at 3-4 teams on the outside looking in that have a legitimate case still to be in the top 16. And it comes down to those razor thin margins. So I think that's where I put a lot of the scrutiny on myself, because I know that's very important. And I'll say this, in recent years, as a member of the ESPN family, ESPN broadcasting the entire tournament. There's a quick turnaround from Selection Sunday to those first 4 games. Mm-hmm. So the people that are in charge of putting production teams together to go out and broadcast these games actually lean on my opinion on those top 16 teams to get a jump on things. If I'm really wrong, I'm letting a lot of people with a lot of money riding on stuff down. So I put that scrutiny on myself. If that's for the only reason, is there, Charlie, we're going to go off your bracket to start getting our production teams in line and start ordering trucks to go to these cities. Okay.
I want to go all the way back. You said LSU is lurking. And I think for a lot of people, especially given the past few years with LSU's non-conference schedule, can you just explain to people how LSU is always lurking? Is it because they play in the SEC? Like, what is going on?
Well, they're super talented, I think. And the fact that they now have a couple of wins. You're right. They didn't play a non-conference schedule worth anything. You can't take any of the games they played outside of they played Duke and take anything away from it. It meant nothing. I know a lot of people talked about how they scored over 100 points, a whole bunch. And I even mentioned it a few times in things I wrote. But the fact of the matter is the level of competition there has to be an asterisk there. The level of competition was not becoming of a team. But we all knew how talented they were and are. And some of their younger players are now starting to play really well to go with this core group of veterans that they have. And we know that they have a great coach. And their net numbers are still, even though their schedule numbers are not good, their overall net number is good. And it puts them at least in that you got to have that conversation about them. And when I say they're lurking, it's because the way the SEC is this year, it's so good. It's so great at the top with so many teams competing for. We got 2 teams right now on the 1 line and 2 teams right now on the 2 line, and I think it's 6 or 6 teams in the top 16. At times it's been 8 on my board. There is a ton of opportunity there if you're LSU to win games that are going to get people's attention. They're going to add to that quad 1 total, and they're going to build that resume. And they're good enough. They're truly good enough, deep enough, and well coached enough that they can beat the Texas or the South Carolinas, which would then give them an opportunity to bump up to that 1 line, replacing one of those 2. I don't think there's any way UConn or UCLA comes off that 1 line. LSU's not going to bump one of those 2 off because, frankly, UConn's unlikely to lose a game this year, and UCLA probably not going to lose again either. The Big Ten's really good, but they're head and shoulders above everybody else. Texas and South Carolina don't have as big a gap between themselves and LSU and Vanderbilt, Oklahoma. And we saw Oklahoma beat South Carolina the other night. And then we saw South Carolina turn around and boat race Vanderbilt. So, but the margin there is much smaller, and they can be had. As I just don't think UCLA or UConn can be had at this point in all likelihood. And they've built up enough of a cushion where it's, even if they are upset, it's not going to matter.
You mentioned UConn. Wagons, the lone undefeated team in women's college basketball. They're beating everybody by 20 plus points. From what you've seen from just your eye test, from the numbers, all of the analytics, their resume right now, is there a chance that this UConn team is actually better than the national championship winning team last season?
I think it is. And I think when you say it out loud that, a team who lost Paige Beckers got better.
Yeah,
right. You feel like you'd be wearing a straitjacket to say something like that. It doesn't make any sense. But the fact is they're deeper. Sarah Strong is that much better, and she is a unbelievable talent. AZ Fudd is a better player. And frankly, they've played better. Like last year's UConn team had those bumps because they weren't quite playing well. They were coached, and you could kind of see it. And you talked to Gino after they beat South Carolina badly in last season, that he was coaching this team incrementally to get them ready to be at their best in March, and they clearly were. This team just was great from the beginning, and they haven't really let up. It's really, they're playing at the same level that they played at right from the start. The problem with UConn, though, is they don't get tested in the Big East this year. And so many of their games are, you watch them for the first quarter and a half, and then it's kind of not where it's like I'm going to turn the channel because I've seen what I need to see. They do have Tennessee coming up this weekend, and they have played. They always play a good non-conference schedule, but they've had their way with that too. So yes, I think they are actually better. The results are better, and maybe if you're talking to Gino Auriemma and he says, "No, I mean Paige was one of the best players I've ever coached. No way we're better," but the fact is, the numbers and the results are better than they were last year.
Gino's too busy talking about Connecticut pizza to worry about if his team is worse.
It is good pizza.
To bring it all the way back before we let you go, because we kind of started talking about the parity of the game, there are a lot of mid-majors that obviously make the tournament, automatic bids. How do you go about bracketing them?
Well, that's a great question. There's where November and December really come into play.
Okay.
There's a certain group of mid-major, if you will call them that, programs that do schedule and get the bigger dogs to schedule them. And if they in a particular year have maybe a little bit better and they knock off one of them, well, then that puts them in a position to be higher seeded. This year we don't have that many of them. I think Princeton is really the only mid-major of sorts that's seeded inside single digits. But in years past, we've had Gonzaga. I think was it 2 years ago was a top 16 team because they beat Stanford in the non-conference. They dominated the WCC, and then they made the Sweet 16. They were that good. South Dakota State's another one that really schedules. Middle Tennessee usually schedules. They're not having a very good year this year, but they have had seasons recently where they were pretty talented and were good enough to be seeded in the kind of the 8-9 range. So a lot of it does go back to strength of schedule. Were you able to schedule games, and did you get one? Did you beat somebody that you're quote unquote not supposed to beat? And that's usually where we start to look at. Then we dig into kind of what do the metrics tell us? How have they continued to play as they get into their leagues that may not be quite as competitive? Did they truly dominate that league? And that's another thing. It's usually for the mid-majors, if they want a single digits type seed, usually requires no more than one loss in their league. They better really be dominant, and they better have had some kind of noteworthy non-conference either schedule or a win. Competing even in playing a series of really good teams, Power 4 conference teams, but competing, but maybe not even winning, still is it's a subjective measure, but it's still a measurable. Competitive in losses is a metric or a piece of criteria that the committee uses. So that's something I like it too. Were those games competitive? Were they tournament? Were they competitive against tournament worthy teams? Could they adjudicate themselves nicely in the tournament based on past results? And if the answer is yes, based on November and December, then we start looking at them as a 7, as an 8, as a 9, something like that.
Quality loss is my favorite little oxymoron that we use so often around this time. It's real. It is very real, but it is the theme of March, it feels like at times. Charlie Creme, you are a genius. You're an encyclopedia. You are the wizard of bracketology. Thanks so much for hanging out with us and sharing so much of your insight.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a great conversation. I love it.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks, Charlie. There's no one better once it comes to bracketology, once we're getting into that time of the year. And I'm seeing the snow outside of my window start to defrost a little bit. That means it's almost March Madness time, Cass. We can at least speak that into existence. But do you want to transition into the WNBA? Because we just got the WNBA schedule release. Loved seeing all the videos, the schedule release videos that we got on social media. First question that I have, though, for you, Cass, and I think a lot of WNBA fans had the same question. How can we have a schedule release when we don't even have a CBA?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very good question. The WNBA got ahead of this. There is no CBA. However, because there's no CBA and they're in a status quo period, league operations move forward as planned. And one of those league operations is you have to plan for the next season. Now, this is usually done with a scheduled release in December, but obviously they were hoping a deal would get done moving forward. So it's done now. League officials, I've heard, are doing this because they need to let teams know, need to let teams plan. Booking hotels, making travel plans, even though it is charter, selling ticket packages for the arenas, booking the arenas because they aren't always part of the ownership group there. You want to give fans opportunities to plan their trips and what games they really want to go to, if they're from out of town, if they're driving in, what have you. The biggest thing, though, is that there is all this chatter about if the season is going to go longer than 44 games. You've heard this pop up quite a bit over the last couple of years. The league did not intend and does not intend to have anything more than a 44-game schedule in 2026. That's because of the FIBA World Cup. So on their end, I was told they felt they could do this because there's no way they're going to add more games under the CBA. This is what it is. And they, it seems like, want to get ahead of all of this for planning while they're in a status quo negotiation period.
I mean, it makes sense, right? As much as we think it can be so easy to just plan what your next 5 months look like, we've got arenas that are hosting concerts. We have arenas that also house hockey games and men's basketball games. There's other events that happen at arenas. And although I know we're all kind of waiting with bated breath for the CBA to get figured out, like all of these logistics don't happen overnight. You can't just wait for the CBA to get agreed upon and then put all of these schedules together. TV networks as well. Like TV networks need to know what slots are going to be filled, what things can you already start to promote. We get Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers on day 2 of the new season. I think that's something that would behoove the league to start promoting as soon as possible.
Yeah, there's always a knock against the WNBA for not getting ahead of things. And it seems like by releasing the schedule, they are kind of getting ahead of things, whatever those reasonings may be. Like, the fact of the matter is both sides have talked about how they do intend to get a deal done and they plan to get a deal done. Well, once a deal is done, to your point, like, how many things are going to happen that do require the CBA. So The expansion draft, free agency, all those things we've talked about, like, there's only so much time before May. Having the schedule out there is a big one. And this doesn't mean that there isn't a chance games could be canceled, but it seems like, just as someone who knows about sports, and has followed like lockouts and whatnot, like, you can just start canceling games off the top if it comes to that. But there does have to be a schedule in place at some point to play games.
You need to at least have some sort of anchor to this season, like with all of these other questions that are swirling up in the air of what does the future of the WNBA look like? What does revenue share look like? What do vet maxes look like? Everything that we've been talking about that is tied up into the CBA, all of that is up in the air. The one thing that we can at least be as close to as certain as possible is that we've got this team against this team on this day, and this is what the rest of the season looks like. But that is another question that I had for you, Cass. I have to assume that there are parts of the CBA that include stipulations about the schedule. We will only take X number of cross-country road trips, no more than X number of cross-country road trips in a certain month, or the number of games. The number 44 has been a big point of contention of what the schedule looks like moving forward. All of those things could potentially be agreed upon in this current CBA. How does that affect 2026? How can we have a schedule if we don't have those loose ends tied up?
Well, the old CBA stipulated that you could have no more than 44 games. I believe that's kind of where it stood. There's other rules about how you travel, which obviously kind of fell out when they introduced charters. If players want to introduce things like this into the CBA, I would imagine that it's just kind of like the free agency moratorium, where you can put in a stipulation that this will not apply to 2026 because we already have a schedule. And anyone who has scheduled even slow pitch softball games in a rec league knows it's very, very difficult. Like I've seen that firsthand. So I'm sure there could be a stipulation that this comes into play in 2027.
Which makes sense. Like you can't roll the schedule out and then all of a sudden make all of these changes to it. To your point, I mean, it's hard enough to plan like coffee with a friend, much less completely changing a schedule. So that makes sense. That's just easiest for everyone involved. What else stands out to you, though, about the schedule? I love that we get Caitlin Clark and Paige Becker so early in the season, superstar on superstar. We get that on day 2 of the new schedule release. But what else stood out to you?
Yeah, I love that matchup. I love that they're doing it early. I think, you had kind of talked to when we were talking the other day about Toronto and Portland get their own opening night. And I do like that. However, I don't love that we keep opening the season on a Friday night with just kind of so-so games. We don't have the TV schedule yet. That will come down the line. But I know in the past, those haven't been nationally televised. And I feel like if you're starting a season, it needs to start with a bang. It needs to have a lot of flair, a lot of excitement. It has to be on a national TV outlet as like, here's the season, especially because we're talking about the 30th anniversary season. So I just wish like there were a better game on Friday night. If you were going to open it there, I guess you could say, Toronto opening its season is great. But I wish there were a little bit more to it. I also like that they are renewing the inaugural game, the Sparks and the Liberty, on the exact day that it was played 30 years ago. That's fun. I love it. Let's tap into history more.
I am so glad that you brought that up. It feels so perfect, doesn't it? Like 2 of the inaugural teams, East Coast, West Coast, Liberty Sparks. It feels just so perfect. It feels like it's just such a full circle moment celebrating 30 years of this league. I do want to go back to what you first said, though, because that's an amazing point that I have been so caught up with Saturday's schedule. I didn't even look. I looked at Friday, but I wasn't even focusing on Friday. But I think that just proves your point that there's not really much about Friday, day 1 of the 2026 season, that really stands out other than Toronto making its debut. I'm glad Toronto gets its own night and Portland gets its own night. Each of these sweet little baby expansion teams get their own respective chances to shine. But on Saturday, we get Dallas and Indiana, Paige Beckers and Caitlin Clark. And then we get the Mercury and the Aces, a little rematch of the WNBA finals. And let me just say, thank you, WNBA, for giving us a finals rematch on day 2 of the season, so we don't have to wait until late July, like we had to wait for this past year to get Liberty Lynx. And then we get Portland getting its debut against Chicago on Saturday night as well. On Friday, we get Connecticut Liberty, Washington Toronto, Golden State and Seattle. They're not bad matchups, but doesn't have the same kind of razzle-dazzle that Saturday has.
It just feels like, maybe just skip over Friday. Now, that said, like one of the difficulties in this is you almost have no idea who's going to be on a lot of these teams. Basically, everyone except for 2 veterans are free agents. But still, like, just imagine starting on Saturday. This is the tip of the WNBA season, and you're seeing the Wings and the Fever, Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers and Aaliyah Boston and all of that. And then you lead directly into Mercury Aces, finals rematch. Can the Mercury finally get one after being swept? And then you have the Chicago Sky, who will possibly still have Angel Reese, it seems like, headlining that, and Portland. Like, that feels like an exciting, this is what we're bragging about start to the WNBA season. And I think that's where the schedule could do better in future years, because this is not the first time that it's been like, ho hum, I forgot.
And also, Dallas has the number 1 overall pick. So there is a very high likelihood that it won't just be Paige Beckers against Caitlin Clark. It could be Paige Beckers and AZ Fudd against Caitlin Clark, which adds even more of, some substance into that matchup as well. So Great point by you. We can do better on Friday. That the first game that kicks off the 30th anniversary season should be something that carries some weight like that. Whether it's, like you mentioned, Sparks Liberty on the 30th anniversary of the league. Just something that carries weight, whether it's historical or current. I'm with you 1000% there. All right, let's look ahead to what we have going on this weekend in Unrivaled action. They're on the hardwood from Friday through Monday. Friday through Monday. But Cass, on Friday, we got games outside of the comfy confines of Miami. Unrivaled, it is headed to Philly.
Yeah, it's heading to brutally cold Philadelphia. Welcome to the Northeast, guys. I know you were having fun in Miami. This is the first time that Unrivaled has played games outside of that soundstage they built as an arena in Miami. They've talked in the past, Alex Vizal, the president there, about playing in different areas, kind of going on what I would call a barnstorming tour a little bit. They've said that Xfinity Arena in Philadelphia is sold out. They're having a watch party, a community day event. This is a chance for them to just reach out to different parts of the country and tap into those fandoms, bring the game to other people. You know, that soundstage only seats, I know it's a little higher than it used to be, but say about 1,000. Xfinity is going to be, 10 plus times that.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably more.
Yeah.
I think the thing about Unrivaled that people have said, and I think you and I have said it as well, is there are no home teams to kind of naturally root for. There's good and bad in that. And so them traveling the country, we'll be able to see how this goes and how they can tap into fans without a home connection like that.
And I think there's value, too, to getting to see it in person. If you are, let's say, a diehard Nafisa Collier fan, a diehard Brianna Stewart fan, if you just like and admire these athletes for who they are as individuals, but you don't live in Miami or anywhere close to Miami, you're not going to be able to see them up close and personal. And it's just not the same as watching it on TV. So let's say if you are, a young women's basketball fan or just a women's basketball fan in general, in living in the Northeast, well, that's so much more accessible to head to Philly. So you can get a little bit more of that connection, that close connection, even though you don't have it in the form of a team that is playing there. Getting to watch it in person just kind of breaks down those barriers a little bit.
Also, it's kind of the idea that we talk about in March Madness about where these super regionals are located and where the Final Four is located. And it's often on these coasts. Miami is great. It is a great place to decide to go on a vacation and maybe bring your son or daughter and see those games. But it's also all the way on the southern tip of Florida. And so to your point, like them going other places allows you to maybe take a drive or a shorter flight or make a weekend out of seeing it. They don't have anything else planned this year, but in the coming years, it could be possible they go other places.
I would love to see it because Miami also in January and February, it's expensive. Everybody wants to be in Miami in January and February. I'm looking at my window to snow right now. I would love to be in Miami right now. So I do love the idea of just being more accessible to fans. So we'll keep an eye on those games. We've also got a ton of action upcoming on the college side of things. We've got Columbia and Princeton, 6:00 Eastern time on Friday. Cass, Princeton is a top 25 team. We just heard Charlie Creme talk about that being one of those mid-major, not traditional power teams that could make a little bit of noise in the tournament. What are you watching for in this one?
Well, this could help determine the Ivy League champion. The Ivy League is a lot of fun. I mean, this is probably the premier mid-major competition. The interesting thing about Columbia is earlier this season, they were actually upset by Cornell. That was a stunning result in the Ivy League. So we'll see how this one goes, but that's a fun little tidbit as you're watching.
Yeah, the Ivy League has been fun the past couple of years. That was like, we were rooting for the Ivies last year in the NCAA tournament. Looks like they can make a trip right back there this season as well. And then on Sunday, Tennessee and UConn at noon. It's, I think, one of the best historical rivalries that we have in the sport, going back to Pat Summitt and Gino, two of the best, most decorated women's college basketball programs that we have. And let's not forget, we got this matchup last year. UConn came into Knoxville and got beat by the Lady Vols.
Yeah, a huge upset by Tennessee in Kim Caldwell's first year. I mean,
yeah,
this is the last probably in all likelihood, this is the last opportunity for someone to end UConn's undefeated regular season. It's their last ranked matchup. These are two, as you said, like historic rivalry programs. It's usually a very good game. And I think Kim Caldwell, we only have that one, but like Kim Caldwell's emergence in Tennessee and how the Lady Vols have been doing under her has really reinvigorated this one. So it should be a good atmosphere and a fun game.
And a great opportunity, if not last opportunity, for UConn to really bolster up their resume. I know, I hear you, UConn fans. They don't need to do any more on their resume. I know, I hear you. Number one team in the country, they absolutely deserve it. But let's not ignore that the Big East is not the Big Ten. It is not the SEC. UConn's not going to play the same caliber of schedule that the South Carolinas, the Texases, the UCLAs are going to play. Like, I hear UCLA fans saying, look, we deserve to be the number one team in the country because we have just the sheer volume of quad one wins that UConn doesn't have. So if UConn's able to, and the game's at home, but if they're able to host Tennessee and beat Tennessee in a pretty emphatic way, well, that's UConn's really last opportunity. They don't have a single ranked matchup left on their schedule. We love the DePauls, the Butlers, and the Creightons of the world, but not the same kind of caliber of teams that we're going to see contending for that number one overall seed. Also, Cass, speaking of UCLA, we have Iowa and UCLA on Sunday. We've got Oklahoma and Texas that afternoon as well. We are chock full of ranked, unranked matchups and in-conference play as well. So we'll keep an eye on those. We'll continue to break all of those down on next week's episode of Hoops 360. Every week we'll do our player spotlight of the week. So maybe you'll learn something new. Learn about one of your player you never heard of before. Maybe you'll hear us wax poetic about your favorite team. So join us next week and always interact with us on the show. If you're watching on YouTube, leave us a comment. Disagree with us? That's fine. Let us know. You have a question, something you want us to touch on, just let us know and we will get to it on next week's edition of Hoops 360. She's Cassandra Negley. I'm Caroline Fenton. See you guys next week.